All right, so today's notes are on solving quadratics by factoring. Our content objective is to solve quadratic equations by factoring, and our language objective is to use the correct terminology to explain that process. So the first thing I want to do is jump into some of that terminology that we will be using. The first term is a quadratic function. So we've been working with quadratic expressions in our last unit. So 4A was all about quadratic expressions, and this is about quadratic functions, or now we're starting our quadratic functions section. So a quadratic function is a function that could be written in the form ax squared plus bx plus c. So we were working with expressions in that form where a is not 0. Standard form of a quadratic is our next thing, and that is y equals ax squared plus bx plus c. So this is where we're starting to get into the equations once we add the y equals part. So that's where we're going today. We're taking what we've been working with and now just making it into an equation. And most importantly, for the next for this section of Unit 4, so 4B, we're going to be learning how to solve quadratics. So one key phrase that we'll be seeing is solve a quadratic, and that is asking you to solve for the x-intercepts of that quadratic. So that's when y equals 0. So x-intercepts is when it crosses the x-axis. So I drew some graphs here so you can see which points we're talking about. We're talking about when it's crossing the x-axis. So it can have two solutions in a couple different ways, or it could have one solution. It could also have one solution opening down. And when I say solutions, that's a synonym for x-intercepts. So x-intercepts are the roots, zeros, or solutions to a quadratic. So that's what we're going to be working on today. So as we know from the title, this section is on solving quadratics by factoring. So I'm going to jump right in to show us, or actually before I do that, the other thing I wanted to mention is we're going to practice 3 ways, or we're going to learn 3 ways to solve a quadratic. The first one we're learning is factoring. So this is today's lesson. You can also use a graphing calculator. So there's really 4 ways, but since we don't have graphing calculators this year, we're going to focus on the 3 ways that we can solve it without one. Then we have completing the square. And last but not least, we'll have the quadratic formula. So this unit, we're learning 3 ways to solve a quadratic, and the first one we're focusing on today is by factoring. So we've learned how to factor in our last unit, and now we're going to build on that and learn how we can actually use that to solve for the x-intercepts of a quadratic. So we're taking that next step to solve for the x-intercepts. So to do that, we're going to use what's called the zero product property. So I'm going to flip, actually I can fit that here. So the zero product property I'm going to be saying this a lot this year. So the zero product property says that if you multiply 2 numbers, so we're going to use the variables a and b. So if I do a times b and I get 0, then one of the 2 things I multiplied has to be 0. So either a equals 0 or b equals 0. So if I multiply 2 things and I get 0, that means one of those 2 things is 0. So if you did 6 times something equals 0, you know the thing you multiplied 6 by must have been 0. This is going to be absolutely essential for this lesson because that's why we can use factoring to solve. So when we break it into factors, our factors are going to be a and b, and since they equal 0, we'll be able to use that to solve for them. So let me flip the page and show you an example of that. So our example for today is going to start with solve x squared minus 5x plus 6 equals 0. So first thing I'm going to do is set the equation equal to 0. That's been done. That was done originally, so they're all set there. Set x squared minus 5x plus 6 equals 0. Step 2 is going to be to factor it. So I'm going to check, is there a GCF? No. My a value is 1, so I can just find factors of c that add to b, so factors of 6 that add to negative 5. So those factors will be negative 2 and negative 3, because I need to multiply to a positive, add to a negative. The only way that's possible is if I have 2 negatives. So I'm going to factor it like that. So I have x minus 2, x minus 3 equals 0. This is where the critical step comes in. So this is where the zero product property allows us to say, okay, I'm multiplying two things. So x minus 2 times x minus 3 equals 0. So I know either x minus 2 equals 0 or x minus 3 equals 0. So since I'm multiplying these two things and they equal 0, the zero product property tells us that one of these things has to be 0. So we know the only way we can multiply two things and get 0 is if one of them is 0. So we did that. And last step is to solve for x in each equation. So to do that, I'm going to add 2 to both sides in my first equation. So I get x equals 2. I'm going to add 3 to both sides here. So I get x equals 3. So my solutions or my x-intercepts for this are going to be 2 and 3, or 2, 0 and 3, 0. I'm all set. So that's all we have to do to solve by factoring is factor like normal and then use the zero product property. That's why I was emphasizing how critical this is, because this is our main difference, or the added step we have going from just factoring to solving. We have to use the zero product property and solve for x. So I'm going to do a quick check to make sure we're all on the same page. I want you to solve x squared minus 7x equals negative 12. So I added one added step here, so I didn't set equal to 0 for you. You have to do that on your own. But I want you to try that one out now. I'm going to go over it. So again here, in order for this to work, I have to set it equal to 0. So I can't use GCF here because my equation is not equal to 0. I can't use the zero product property unless my equation is equal to 0. So I'm going to start this problem by adding 12 to both sides so that I can set my equation equal to 0. So that's the first key thing you have to do is set it equal to 0. Now I'm going to factor per usual. There's no GCF. My a value is 1, so I'm going to find factors of positive 12 that add to negative 7. Again, since they're multiplying to a positive, adding to a negative, I know they're both going to be negative, so they'll be negative 3, negative 4. So I get x minus 3 times x minus 4 equals 0. I'm multiplying two things and they equal 0. So I know I'm going to continue this up here. Either x minus 3 equals 0 or x minus 4 equals 0. So x will equal 3 or x will equal 4. And that is those are my solutions. Those are my x-intercepts. So I'm going to have us do one more just because I want to make sure we haven't forgotten all our methods of factoring. So I'm going to do one more quick check with us. We have 3x squared minus 16x minus 12 equals 0. Again, I want you to solve this. Sorry, I forgot to write the word solve, but please solve this one out. I'm going to try it, or I'm going to go over it now. So try it on your own first. There is no GCF, so these are not divisible by 3, they're not divisible by 2. But this time my a value is not 1, so I have to use my middle term splitting method. So I'm going to do a times c, which is going to be 3 times negative 12, or negative 36. So I'm finding factors of negative 36 that add to negative 16. Again, if you had to list these out, that's fine, but I know they're going to be negative 18 and 2 because they have to be one positive, one negative. The negative number needs to be greater absolute value-wise. So it's going to be negative 18 and 2. I'm going to split that middle term. So I have 3x squared minus 18x plus 2x minus 12 equals 0. Group my first two and last two. My GCF in the first one is going to be 3x. So I have 3x times x minus 6. The other one is going to have a GCF of 2. So I have plus 2, x minus 6. I take out my GCF of x minus 6, 3x plus 2. This all still equals 0. So now I can use my zero product property. So I can say x minus 6 equals 0, or 3x plus 2 equals 0. Add 6 to both sides here, and I get x equals 6. So there's one solution. This one I have to do 2 steps. So I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides, and I get 3x equals -2. And then I divide both sides by 3 to get x alone. So sorry if I wrote that too small. But you divide both sides by 3 and you get x equals -2/3, or -2/3. And that is my other answer. Just as a quick note, if it's helpful, if you want to make sure you factor this correctly and solved correctly, you can always plug your x intercepts back into your equation and it should give you 0. So if you plug these back into your equation, this should end up with 0 equals 0. If it doesn't, you know you've done something wrong. So that's it for today. Make sure you write down any questions, comments, or concerns you have so we can go over it together in class.